You might notice something subtle when you begin looking at your life through this lens. The patterns that once felt random start to show a kind of direction, even when that direction is uncomfortable. Not everything that repeats is a mistake, and not everything that hurts is a misalignment. Some experiences are not interruptions to your path, they are the path expressing itself through pressure. When you begin to see that, the question changes from, why is this happening to me? So, what is this shaping within me? Trauma, especially when it moves through generations, carries a kind of density that is easy to misinterpret. Most people assume that density means something has gone wrong, or that it should not be there at all. But density is not always a sign of damage. It is often a sign of concentration, like something being compressed so that it can eventually release more power. When you view it this way, trauma stops being just a wound and starts becoming a field of potential that has not yet been fully understood. That does not make the experience easy, and it is not meant to. Difficulty is not the same as misalignment. Some of the most aligned paths feel the heaviest because they are working through material that has not been resolved before. When something has been carried across multiple generations, it gathers layers, and those layers create resistance. That resistance is not there to stop you. It is there because something significant is trying to move through. You may start to see this in the way certain emotional reactions seem bigger than the moment itself. A small situation can trigger a response that feels far deeper than what is happening on the surface. That is often a sign that you are not just reacting as an individual, but as a part of a larger pattern that has been carried forward. The intensity does not come from nowhere. It comes from accumulation. And when you are the one experiencing it consciously, you are also the one closest to changing it. Most people try to avoid that intensity, and that is understandable. It can feel overwhelming, confusing, and at times unfair. But avoidance does not dissolve the pattern. It simply delays its transformation. When something is ready to be seen, it will continue to surface in different forms until it is recognized clearly. That is why similar situations can appear again and again, even when they look different on the outside. There is a mechanism behind that repetition that is often missed. Patterns persist, not because they are strong, but because they are incomplete. Something within them has not been fully processed, understood, or integrated. So instead of ending, they adapt and reappear, looking for a point of resolution. When you are inside one of those moments, it can feel like you are stuck. But from a wider perspective, you are actually being brought back to the exact place where change is possible. This is where perspective begins to shift. Instead of seeing yourself as someone who inherited problems, you begin to see yourself as someone who encountered unfinished material. That material is not your identity, but it is part of your environment. And like any environment, it influences how you think, feel, and respond until you become aware of it. Awareness is not just noticing the pattern. It is recognizing that you are not the pattern itself. Once that separation becomes clear, something important starts to happen. You gain space between what you feel and how you respond. The emotion may still rise, but it no longer controls the outcome in the same way. That space is where change begins, not because you force it, but because you are no longer moving automatically. The pattern loses its ability to repeat itself exactly as it did before. You may also begin to notice that breaking a pattern does not always feel like relief at first. Sometimes it feels unfamiliar, even uncomfortable, because you are stepping outside of what has been known for a long time. The nervous system has adapted to the pattern, even if the pattern was painful. So when something different happens, it can feel uncertain, even though it is actually movement in a new direction. That uncertainty is not a sign that you are doing something wrong. It is a sign that something is changing. Another layer becomes visible when you look at how these patterns affect not just individuals, but entire family systems. Behaviors, beliefs, and emotional responses can move through generations without being questioned. They become normal simply because they are repeated. And when something is normalized, it becomes invisible, even when it is limiting. That is why awareness is such a powerful shift, because it brings visibility to what was previously unquestioned. When you begin to see clearly, you also begin to make different choices, sometimes in very small ways. You respond differently in conversation. You pause where you used to react immediately. You notice a thought instead of believing it without question. These changes may seem minor, but they are not. Each one interrupts the pattern just enough to create a new direction. And over time, those small interruptions become a complete shift. It is also important to understand that you do not have to resolve everything at once. Transformation does not happen through force. It happens through consistent awareness and gradual change. Trying to fix everything immediately often creates more pressure, which can actually reinforce the pattern. But allowing yourself to see clearly, moment by moment, creates a different kind of movement, one that is steady, sustainable, and real. There is also a deeper implication that starts to emerge when you stay with this long enough. When you shift a pattern within yourself, you are not just changing your own experience. You are altering the way that pattern continues beyond you. What was once passed forward unconsciously now has a different path available. That does not mean everything changes instantly, but it does mean something fundamental has been interrupted. You might begin to feel a different kind of responsibility when you see it this way. Not a heavy or burdensome one, but a clear recognition that your awareness matters. The way you understand your experience influences what becomes possible next. And that influence is not limited to you alone. It extends outward in ways that are not always immediately visible, but are still real. At the same time, it is important not to turn this into pressure or expectation. You're not required to be perfect in how you navigate these patterns. You will still have moments where you fall back into old responses, and that is part of the process. Awareness does not eliminate difficulty, it changes your relationship to it, and that change is what allows something new to form over time. You may notice that as this understanding deepens, the meaning of your experiences begins to shift. What once felt like something you needed to escape starts to feel like something you can move through. The same situations that once felt overwhelming begin to feel more navigable, not because they disappear, but because you are no longer meeting them in the same way. Your position within the experience changes, and that changes the experience itself. And as that continues, a quieter realization starts to take shape, that some of the heaviest parts of your lineage were not chosen in spite of their difficulty, but because of what they make possible when they are finally understood. Not all at once, and not in a single moment, but through a series of shifts that begin to reshape how the past moves into the future. You may begin to understand something important once you stop treating trauma as only an event and start seeing it as a pattern of adaptation. What lasts is not just what happened, but what the system learned it had to become in response. A family, a bloodline, even an entire people can organize themselves around an old injury long after the original moment has passed. When that happens, the trauma is no longer only memory, it becomes method. That method shows up in ordinary life more often than people realize. It can appear as overprotection, that feels like love until you notice how little room it leaves for trust. It can appear as emotional distance that sounds like strength until you notice how much tenderness it keeps locked away. It can appear as constant readiness, where rest feels unnatural and ease feels irresponsible. The inherited pattern often survives because it worked once, and what worked once becomes sacred even when it starts causing damage. This is why healing does not begin with blame. If you start by blaming the previous generation, you miss the mechanism. Most people were not trying to pass on pain. They were trying to pass on survival, and they often could not separate the two. They handed forward the exact shape of consciousness that kept them functioning inside pressure, not realizing that the same shape might limit the next generation once the conditions change. You can see this clearly when you look at how families interpret safety. In one lineage, safety may mean silence, because speaking openly once created danger. In another, safety may mean staying close, because separation once meant loss. In another, safety may mean outperforming everyone around you, because excellence was the only reliable shield. The child grows up thinking these are personality traits, but underneath them is a survival conclusion that was formed before the child arrived. Once that becomes visible, ancestral trauma starts to look less like a curse and more like a code that has not been updated. The problem is not that the code exists. The problem is that it continues running after the environment has changed. A system trained in scarcity may still hoard when there is enough. A system trained in suspicion may still push away love when love is finally present. A system trained in emotional suppression may still confuse numbness with maturity, even when expression is now possible. That is where oversoul evolution becomes easier to understand. The soul is not only entering a family, it is entering a code base. It is stepping into a system of emotional assumptions, relational instincts, and behavioral defaults that were built over time. If the code is outdated, the line will keep running the same commands until someone becomes conscious enough to see what is happening. That is why certain people are born not merely to belong to a lineage, but to translate it into its next form. This often feels heavier than people expect because updating a system does not feel like being rewarded. It feels like friction. It feels like loving people while no longer being able to move the way they move. It feels like recognizing familiar patterns and realizing that if you keep participating in them, you will hand them forward again. That realization can be painful, not because it is wrong, but because it forces honesty where habit once lived. You may notice that breaking a pattern often creates emotional confusion before it creates peace. A person who was trained to calm everyone else may feel selfish the first time they protect their own energy. A person who was trained to expect betrayal may feel exposed when they choose trust with discernment. A person who was trained to equate struggle with value may feel almost disoriented when life becomes simpler. The nervous system does not immediately know how to relax when vigilance has been treated as love. This is one reason trauma fields can produce so much growth. They force the distinction between what is familiar and what is actually true. Familiarity has tremendous power because the body often chooses what it recognizes before it chooses what is healthy. That is why people can leave painful situations and still recreate their emotional climate somewhere else. Until the internal pattern changes, the outer circumstances are often reorganized to match the same inherited expectations. Once you understand that, you start to see why generational healing matters far beyond personal comfort. If a pattern remains unconscious, it keeps designing relationships, parenting styles, conflict patterns, and even spiritual beliefs. It shapes what a family thinks is normal. It shapes what they call respect, what they call love, what they call discipline, and what they call strength. A single unexamined trauma can define an entire moral atmosphere without ever naming itself directly. This is also why healing is not merely emotional release. Release is part of it, but the deeper work is reinterpretation. Something old has to be seen in a new light. A family may have treated emotional restraint as maturity, when in reality, it was fear of exposure. A bloodline may have treated overachievement as purpose, when in reality, it was protection against invisibility. Once the hidden function is revealed, the pattern begins to loosen because it no longer needs to disguise itself as virtue. There is a perspective shift here that changes everything. The question stops being whether your family was broken and becomes what your family had to become in order to endure. That does not excuse harm. It does not erase responsibility, but it introduces compassion without losing clarity. And that combination is necessary because healing fails when it becomes either sentimental or cruel. If you are the one becoming conscious of the pattern, you may feel caught between two loyalties. One loyalty is to the people who raised you, the codes that shaped you, the emotional language you learned before you had choices. The other loyalty is to truth, to what you can now see clearly, and to what will continue unless someone chooses differently. This is why people in healing work often feel like bridges. They are standing inside love while also refusing repetition. That bridge position is not always comfortable, but it is often meaningful. It asks you to hold what was valuable without carrying forward what was damaging. It asks you to keep the strength while releasing the fear that once powered it. It asks you to preserve the love while changing the form through which love is expressed. In that sense, healing is not rejection of lineage, it is refinement of lineage. And when that refinement begins, the impact is rarely limited to one person. A child raised by someone who has become conscious of an inherited pattern enters a different atmosphere, even if only slightly. A relationship touched by self-awareness stops feeding the same emotional machinery. A family conversation changes because one person no longer reacts in the expected way. These shifts may look small on the surface, but they alter the direction of the current. This is why breaking a generational pattern can amplify the entire oversoul. What changes in one life does not stay locked inside that one life. A new response creates a new line of possibility. It alters what becomes easier for the next person, what becomes visible to the next generation, what no longer has to be learned through pain alone. And once you begin seeing ancestral trauma this way, not as punishment, but as concentrated material waiting for transformation, you start to realize that some of the heaviest inheritances were never meant to be carried forever, only far enough to be understood differently. Something becomes easier to understand once you stop looking for healing only in relief and start noticing it in reorganization. Many people assume that healing should feel like immediate peace, but often it feels like a shift in what you can no longer participate in. You become less available to familiar dynamics, less willing to carry emotional weights that were once treated as normal, less able to call inherited pain by softer names. That change can feel disruptive at first, but what is actually happening is that your system is refusing to keep translating trauma into identity. This matters because ancestral trauma often survives by convincing people that it is simply who they are. A family may say, "We are just hard on each other," when what they really mean is that tenderness was never safe enough to develop. A bloodline may say, "We are just private people," when what they really mean is that vulnerability once had consequences they could not afford. A community may say, "We are just built to endure," when what they really mean is that pain became so common it had to be framed as strength. The pattern protects itself by becoming part of the self-image. Once you see that, the work changes. You are no longer trying to become someone else. You are trying to separate inherited adaptation from actual essence. That distinction is one of the most important things a person can learn, because without it, every attempt at healing feels like betrayal. With it, you start to realize that what you are releasing was never the deepest truth of you, even if it shaped the way you learned to move through life. You may notice this most clearly in moments that seem small. The instant you choose not to explain yourself to someone committed to misunderstanding you. The instant you recognize guilt rising and realize it is not guidance, only an old conditioning response. The instant you stay present with emotion instead of organizing your entire life around avoiding it. These moments matter because patterns weaken when they are no longer treated as commands. There is also a quieter layer to this that many people overlook. Trauma does not only shape what you fear, it also shapes what you believe you are allowed to want. A lineage marked by scarcity can make peace feel unrealistic. A lineage marked by betrayal can make deep love feel suspicious. A lineage marked by suppression can make self-expression feel indulgent or unsafe. So healing is not only about releasing pain, it is also about expanding your sense of what is permitted. This is one reason heavy lineages can carry such catalytic potential. The more compressed the field, the more significant the release once awareness enters it. What has been held tightly for generations does not transform in shallow ways. When it changes the emotional architecture of what becomes thinkable, speakable, and livable. That is why one person becoming conscious can have a greater effect than it first appears to have. You may begin to understand this when you look at what people around you start reacting to once you change. Sometimes they are not reacting to you personally. They are reacting to the end of a pattern they depended on without realizing it. If you stop overfunctioning, others may suddenly feel their own underdevelopment. If you stop absorbing emotional chaos, others may feel the full weight of what they usually offload. Your healing can disturb a system simply because the system was arranged around your unconscious participation. That can make the process feel lonelier than expected. People often imagine healing as a path toward connection, and it is, but not always immediately. In the early stages, healing can expose how much of your belonging was based on repetition rather than truth. It can show you which relationships require your dysregulation, your silence, your self-abandonment, or your constant availability. This is painful not because healing is wrong, but because clarity changes the terms of connection. Still, the loneliness is not the final meaning of it. Over time, something more stable begins to form. You begin to relate from choice rather than compulsion. You start recognizing when care is genuine and when it is merely familiar. You learn that peace is not emptiness, and that the absence of emotional chaos does not mean the absence of love. This is a deep shift because it changes not only how you feel, but what you are capable of recognizing as healthy. There is another mechanism at work here that deserves attention. When a person interrupts a generational pattern, they're not just changing behavior, they're changing expectation. The nervous system begins to stop predicting the same outcome in every similar situation. It starts making room for new interpretations, which then allow new responses, which then create different experiences. This is how a lineage begins to evolve from the inside out, not by erasing history, but by refusing to let history be the only author of the future. That change in expectation is subtle, but it is powerful. A person who no longer expects abandonment does not make the same decisions as one who does. A person who no longer expects punishment for honesty does not speak the same way. A person who no longer expects exhaustion as the price of worth does not organize life the same way. The inner shift alters the outer pattern because what you anticipate shapes what you allow, what you tolerate, and what you create. You may also notice that healing ancestral trauma often changes your relationship with time. The past no longer feels like something fixed and separate. It starts to feel present in your habits, your interpretations, your instincts, your body, and your emotional reflexes. But at the same time, the future begins to feel less predetermined. Once you see the mechanism, you are no longer trapped inside the idea that what has been repeated must continue. That is one of the deepest forms of hope. Not emotional optimism, but structural possibility. This is where the phrase density zone begins to mean something more precise. A density zone is not simply a hard life or a painful family. It is a field where unresolved material has accumulated enough force that small changes create disproportionate effects. In a lighter field, healing may be more gradual and less dramatic. In a dense field, one clear interruption can shift the emotional pattern of an entire line. That does not make the process easier, but it does explain why so much can hinge on one person's awareness. And when you begin to see yourself that way, not as someone burdened by a broken inheritance, but as someone standing in a concentrated field of unfinished transformation, dignity returns. Not the kind of dignity that comes from superiority, but the kind that comes from accurate sight. You understand that what felt excessive in your life may have been exact. The intensity was not proof that you were being punished. It may have been proof that you were positioned where change could matter most. That realization also softens the way you look back. You do not need to romanticize what happened in order to find meaning in what it produced. You do not need to excuse your ancestors in order to see the conditions they were surviving. You do not need to choose between compassion and truth. The deeper view allows both. It lets you say, this hurt, and also, this was carried farther than it should have been because no one had yet learned how to set it down differently. Eventually, you begin to feel that healing is not a private achievement at all. It is a form of stewardship. It is how one life becomes a place where inherited pain is no longer passed forward in the same language. It is how a bloodline develops new emotional options. It is how tenderness, honesty, boundaries, and rest become more available to those who come after. Even if they never know your name in that context, they may still live inside the atmosphere your choices helped create. And once you begin to understand ancestral trauma this way, as concentrated material capable of producing equally concentrated transformation, something opens that had been difficult to see before. The question is no longer only what hurt was carried, it becomes what gifts were buried beneath the hurt, what strengths were distorted by survival, and what forms of wisdom may only become visible after the weight has been met clearly enough to stop mistaking it for the whole inheritance.
If this transmission resonated, the spiral continues. You did not arrive here by chance, and you do not leave unchanged. More teachings are unfolding across the Vaharat library, each one meeting you where you are, not where you think you should be. Follow resonance. The next threshold is already listening.